Gary Johnson, two-term governor of New Mexico from 1995 to 2003, has been a consistent advocate for limited, efficient government and personal liberty. Johnson switched from the Republican Party to the Libertarian Party at the end of 2011. As the Libertarian Party nominee for President of the United States, Johnson will appear on all 50 state ballots. An outspoken pro-Constitution libertarian, Johnson would end the war in Afghanistan now. He opposes the failed multi-billion-dollar war on drugs and demands greater transparency at the Federal Reserve. As president, he would cut federal spending by 43%, slash debt, and make government live within its means while reducing taxes and regulation to foster real job creation and economic opportunity. An avid skier and bicyclist, Johnson has reached the highest peaks on 4 of the 7 continents, including Mount Everest. Gary Johnson, welcome to the Global Freedom Report. How are you?
Brent, it's great being with you, and I'm actually in Las Vegas at Freedom Fest, so a whole bunch of like-minded individuals. Really been a fun event, and it's been the third of these that I've been. Look forward to another day here.
Oh, fantastic. I've got to ask you, you reached the highest peaks on 4 continents, including Mount Everest. Can you just briefly tell us what that was like, climbing Mount Everest?
Well, it was everything I hoped it would be, halfway around the planet, and did get to the top. So, halfway around the planet, flying to Kathmandu, then flying to Lukla. It's a 36-mile trek to base camp. No running water, nothing motorized, no electricity, and went up and down the mountain 6 different times. Up, down, up a little bit higher, stay a little bit longer. Came up against the weather, didn't look like we were going to summit, and actually on the very last day of our permit, we summited on a clear day where you could see all of the 8,000-meter peaks in the world.
Wow. How long did it take you to get to the top?
So we arrived, we flew to Lukla on March 27th, and we summited on May 30th.
Wow. Oh.
We got to, yeah, it was wonderful. It took 11 days to get to base camp. So we were at base camp April 6th. And like I say, summited on May 30th.
That's amazing. Congratulations on having done that.
Oh,
all right.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about the issues at hand. Let's start with foreign wars. Part of your platform is a promise to end the undeclared war in Afghanistan. What's your position on making war anywhere without first obtaining a congressional declaration of war?
Well, I'm against our military intervention, and I would not engage in any military intervention without congressional approval. I think that it's probably the most important approval that any president would receive, and of course, it is constitutional.
Yes, well, that's absolutely so. Okay, how would you end the war in Afghanistan? I mean, it's a very complicated part of the world and a lot of tribal stuff going on. How would you end the so-called war in Afghanistan?
Well, I would just point out, Brent, that regardless of when we pull out, whether that's tomorrow or, and by the way, if we don't pull out tomorrow, let's just say we pull out 10 years from now, all the issues that we're going to have 10 years from now, all the complications that we're going to have 10 years from now are going to be the same complications that we're going to have doing this tomorrow. So as complicated as it is, I'm elected President of the United States. Between the time I'm elected and the time I take office, we'll have the actual, we'll have the orders out, and we'll be out. Now, does getting out of Afghanistan mean tomorrow, or does that mean 2 months from tomorrow? Reality might be 2 months from tomorrow, but it's certainly not years from tomorrow. And although I supported the initial going into Afghanistan to go after al-Qaeda, which I believe attacked the United States, I think mission accomplished in Afghanistan was done in a 6-month period, and that we should have gotten out of Afghanistan 11 years ago.
Yeah, well, when do we ever get out of any place we've gone into? Yeah, and I take
we never get it.
Yes, I take it you would change that if you get into the White House.
Well, my entire life I've watched unintended consequences go along with our military engagement. I'm just going to point out the obvious and something that I'm sure you talk about all the time. Libya, we displaced Muammar Gaddafi. His personal army goes off to Mali and displaces the democracy of Mali. So we're down one democracy for our intervention in Libya. And who's going to take over in Libya? Well, probably another authoritarian dictatorship. And who's to say what the consequences of that will be several years from now?
Exactly. You've gone on record as stating that the so-called war on drugs has failed. Would you support the legalization of marijuana, and what would you do about prohibitions on other drug use?
Well, since 1989, I've advocated legalizing marijuana. I think we're at a tipping point on this issue right now in this country. That 50% of Americans now support legalizing marijuana. Why is that number as high as it is? Well, people are talking about the issue, and the more people talk about the issue, the better the issue does. And it starts with the notion that 90% of the drug problem is prohibition-related, not use-related. That's not to discount problems with use, but that should be the focus. But I think we're at a tipping point regarding marijuana. I think the tipping point is Colorado. It's on the ballot in Colorado this fall, an initiative to regulate marijuana like alcohol. I think it's going to pass. I think when it does, it'll be the first of 50 state dominoes that will fall regarding drug policy. And I do believe that once we legalize marijuana, that we will take giant strides forward when it comes to drug policy, overall drug policy, and those overall positive steps will be looking at the drug issue first as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. If we were to legalize all drugs tomorrow, the world would be a better place. But we need to start with marijuana, and when we start with marijuana, like I say, I think everybody will notice that the country's a better place to live. Police will be going out and enforcing real crime. The court dockets will be freed up. And you know what? Maybe we can let a lot of the individuals that are incarcerated now for victimless, nonviolent drug crimes, selling drugs, out of jail to relieve what is the largest prison population on a per capita basis in the world today. Actually, per capita and even overall numbers. 2.3 million people behind bars in this country.
Which is more people than many countries have as their overall populations, yes. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve. Would you renew its lease?
I would not, but I do think this involves congressional action. I would just sign off on congressional authorization to eliminate the Federal Reserve. Now, Brent, if you're saying something that I have not heard before, could the President of the United States actually does the Federal Reserve sunset? And if I were President of the United States, I would let it sunset. Is that the case?
Unclear, but there has been some rumblings about this, and I was curious what your position would be if the opportunity was presented to you. I know you favor greater transparency with the Fed, but I mean, if you actually could say, let's get rid of the Fed, would you do it? And I was curious as to what your position would be. So, no, it's unclear at this point, but I think it'll become very clear in the next few months or so as we get closer. I have a question from the chat.
And just quickly reiterate that. If Congress gave me a piece of legislation abolishing the Federal Reserve, I would sign it. If the Federal Reserve sunset, I would let it sunset.
Excellent. We have a question from Cyborg, PSI, Cyborg, for you. The Libertarians have an oath. I hereby certify that I do not believe in nor advocate the initiation of the use of force to achieve political or social goals. Yet they support the Second Amendment. How is this justified given the way things are going in this country?
Well, I think the Second Amendment is the notion that it was established to protect you and I from the government. So against force, and but not against defense, and that would start with personal defense. So I support the United States Constitution, and I don't know as the Second Amendment to be any more clear than it is.
And actually, the Second Amendment really is not, it's not a violent amendment. It simply says that the government shall not restrict your right to defend your own life and liberty and property. And I don't see that as violent either. But good question, Cyborg. You claim, Gary, that as president you would cut federal spending by 43%. Now we hear politicians tossing figures about all the time. Where do you come up with that figure, and what would you cut?
Well, Brent, I can't promise to cut government expenditures by 43%. And so I have not promised to cut government expenditures by 43%. What I've promised is I'm going to submit a budget that will have a 43% reduction in that budget. And can you imagine how contentious that document is going to be, and the debate and the discussion that is going to ensue around a 43% reduction in government spending? Well, 43% represents $1.4 trillion. It represents the deficit spending that we're currently engaged in. So I think that we need to eliminate the deficit now. And I say that from the standpoint that I believe that we're going to experience a monetary collapse as a result of borrowing and printing money to the tune of 43 cents out of every dollar that we're spending. This is the solution to preventing that monetary collapse. And a monetary collapse, very simply, is when the dollars that we have in our pockets don't buy anything. But I always like to talk about starting out with the big ticket items. Entitlements need to be reformed. Medicaid, Medicare need to be cut by 43%. Social Security, there aren't any cuts to Social Security, but there are some things that need to be changed regarding Social Security to make it a solvent into the future. And then I am proposing a 43% reduction in military spending, which is a combination of reducing nuclear warheads, getting out of all the military conflict that we're currently engaged in, reducing our military footprint on the planet. That would be bases, that would be our military in uniform stationed in Europe, Japan, South Korea. It would be research and development. It would be intelligence. It would be military in uniform and the civilian support staff that goes along with that. So that's my pledge. I pledge to submit a balanced budget to Congress, and I pledge to veto any legislation where expenses exceed revenue, believing that if those two promises are kept, even if Congress overrides the veto, spending will be lower than any other scenario you could possibly come up with.
How would you slash the federal debt?
How would I slash federal debt? You know, that we're not even talking about the debt here. We're not even talking about $16 trillion. We're just talking about the deficit.
Right.
So we've got to start with the deficit. I think there is an absolute unwillingness on the part of everyone that is involved politically in doing that. And my intention is to bring that about. If we get to that point, then yeah, I'll be the first one to put a plan on the table to actually reduce and eliminate the deficit. But look, we got to start off with we have to reduce or eliminate the debt. We have to start off by eliminating the deficit.
Okay, now you have stated that you would go about forcing the government to live within its means while simultaneously reducing taxes and regulations. Now, to somebody like me, that's like a dream come true. But in the existing political climate, forget about the reducing taxes for a moment. How would you ever force the government to live within its means? What could the president do toward that end?
Well, the president can lead by example. The president can ground Air Force One, so I'm going to be the only presidential candidate that isn't going to fly around in Air Force One setting that example. The President of the United States can set the example when it comes to the executive branch and the money that it spends. I will be spending 43% less money as the executive branch, and I can't force government to cut spending. Although, if I'm elected President of the United States, the wind would be at my back, and I do promise to submit that balanced budget. And if you want to call that force, I am going to force Congress to reduce their spending. No question about it.
Okay, now, simultaneously reducing taxes and regulations. Again, I love it. So would most people. But how do you go about accomplishing the one while reducing taxes and regulations?
Well, I am promising to advocate on the part of throwing out the entire federal tax, throwing out the income tax, throwing out corporate tax, abolishing the IRS, and replacing it with one federal consumption tax. In this case, I am embracing the fair tax. I think that by the way, it's revenue neutral, although the budget people score it as a tax reduction. But I really believe that it reboots the American economy in a really big way, that it makes goods and services that we have for export 23% more competitive, and it's really the answer when it comes to creating jobs. That in a zero corporate tax rate environment, if the private sector does not create tens of millions of jobs with a zero corporate tax rate, I don't know what it's going to take to create tens of millions of jobs. And I see implementation of the fair tax as a way of bringing back manufacturing jobs from all over the planet, because this would be the environment conducting business under.
Now, I have to tell you, I have read, I don't know if it's the most recent version, but the most recent version I've seen of the Fair Tax Act, and in it, it calls for IRS participation, and nowhere in it does it preclude the government from reinstituting an income tax later on. And I've kind of learned not to trust the government. So when you say you support the Fair Tax Act, I would hope that you would support a version of it that would be more definitive about eliminating the income tax. Because it's one thing to say the tax is gone, then some president 8 years from now comes in and says, we're going to bring this tax back, we need more revenue, and we start all over again, we got an extra consumption tax on top of everything else.
No, I think your criticism is justified, but Brent, my understanding of the fair tax is that adopting the fair tax allows for 6 years for there to be constitutional elimination of the 16th Amendment allowing for the income tax to begin with. So the fair tax is dependent on repeal of the 16th Amendment. They allow 6 years for that repeal to take place, and if it doesn't take place in the fair tax legislation, then the fair tax goes away and it reverts back to what was before. I also believe that it's a 2-year phase out of the IRS signing off on it initially, but it does eliminate the IRS as an agent.
Now, I have to, just because I'm an educator, I have to give you a little tidbit here on the 16th Amendment. If you take a look, and when you have a chance, do so, the 13th, 14th, 15th, 17th, 18th, 19th Amendments all contain something called an enabling clause. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The 16th Amendment lacks an enabling clause, suggesting that it has nothing to do with the current taxing authority and is more of a distraction than anything else. I want to suggest that you just take a look into that, because you may find some interesting information. How do people learn more about your candidacy and support?
Well, Gary Johnson, 2012, and just to go back to your earlier statement, I do understand exactly what you have said, and that there is no enabling legislation. But for whatever it's worth, the fair tax does include 16th Amendment, repeal of the 16th Amendment. Finding out about Gary Johnson, GaryJohnson2012.com. I really do believe, and for anybody listening, you've got to recognize that I don't think I'm the third choice. I think I'm the only choice.
Oh, hey, listen, you got my vote. I mean, I'm so fed up with the Demubblicans and the Republicrats, and it's all the same thing. And it really is time, to do something different. Whatever the pros and cons of changing our ways, I think we need to change our ways. Gary Johnson, it has been an absolute pleasure having you. The best of luck with your campaign and your candidacy. We'll keep following it, and if time allows, we'll bring you back as we get closer to the election.
I'll hold you to that promise. Thank you. Great being on.
Thanks. www.GaryJohnson2012, GaryJohnson2012.com.